Good morning, everyone. My name is Ken Kortz, and I'm the Interim Dean of the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. We're so pleased you can join us today as we begin this 22nd annual Rotman Lifelong Learning Conference for Leaders. Although we're meeting virtually, we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. This year's conference theme, Creative Minds and Inspiring Ideas, New Approaches to Unlocking Business Opportunities, will focus on creativity, curiosity, and passion and how they can provide transformative professional insights. We begin this year's conference with a straightforward question: what does it mean to be creative? It's not unusual, of course, to consider creativity as the domain of people we think of as artists, painters, performers, musicians, and poets, who use creativity as a means of expressing their individuality and the human spirit. But in a broader sense, creativity permeates every part of our society and our economy. It's what fuels experimentation and innovation. As we've seen so vividly over the past year, people have been being creative in all kinds of ways. They've been revolutionizing how they work, in adapting business models to the pandemic, and so on. And that type of reinvention and innovation is a hallmark of creativity, just like artistic creativity. And it's a form of creativity that merits our attention. Mm-hmm. As digital disruption and emerging challenges impact entire sectors of the economy, creativity and innovation are becoming the must-have skills of the 21st century. Mm-hmm. So we want to examine questions like, how can we embrace creativity at work? What can we learn from artists, misfits, and rebel geniuses who embody creativity maybe in the way we often think about it? So we're excited to explore these questions and more at this year's conference, which we ourselves have reinvented as a three-part series. So this morning and over the next 2 weeks, we'll host conversations with leading thinkers who've devoted themselves to understanding how we can all harness our own creativity. Mm-hmm. With that, I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Natalie Nixon. Natalie is the creativity strategist and president of Figure Eight Thinking, a successful consulting practice where she empowers leaders and organizations to apply creativity and foresight for transformative business results. Previously, Natalie was a fellow at the Paris D School, a lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania, and the founding director of the Strategic Design MBA program at Thomas Jefferson University. Natalie is the author of The Creativity Leap: Unleash Curiosity, Improvisation, and Intuition at Work, which many of you will receive in the mail shortly. Natalie will be interviewed today by Erica M. Erica is founder and CEO of YMC.ca and M & Company, where she has extensive experience creating content and community. M & Company has partnered with some of the world's top brands to create memorable digital marketing campaigns. Erica spent decades as a speaker and as an iconic television personality, and she's received numerous marketing and publishing awards. If you have questions during the conversation between Natalie and Erica, please submit them by visiting slido.com, SLIDO.com, and entering the code Nixon in all capitals. That link for submitting questions through Slido is also available in the description on this YouTube page. Natalie and Erica, the stage is yours.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dean Kortz. It really is such an honor and a privilege to be hosting today's conversation. You know, I frequently attend Rotman events. Back when we were allowed to meet in person, I attended so many in the building, and then I discovered this series online. I was like, the idea of being a lifelong learner is so exciting for me. And I hope that this morning's discussion with Natalie about making a creativity leap lights you up. Listen, I absolutely adore the book. Here's a copy of it. I found it really down to earth, really practical, and it really shifts the lens on what creativity is, where to find it, and of course, most importantly, how to harness it. So as the dean said, the notion of creativity being required for the arts is so outdated. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth, especially in our new economy. Some call it the pivot economy, some call it the circle economy. Natalie calls it the fourth industrial revolution. Listen, you can call it whatever you want, but the bottom line is that if you are going to outsmart, or should I say maybe out-innovate your competitors to stay ahead of the pack, then creativity is the skill you need to do it. So today's chat is going to be relevant to all of us. I mean, we're all going to have to pivot and reinvent many times in our lives. The conversation is going to be helpful to educators who will need to reassess and redesign what and how schools teach in the coming years, if this learning will even be in schools. And it will be useful for CEOs and those in charge of the bottom line to understand how creativity is so tied to profit. And on a personal note, as someone who often feels like an outlier, as Dean Kortz said, the misfits in the corporate world, I think it's because I have always put a value on intuition and creativity. And sometimes, Natalie will get this, I boldly ask questions that may appear naive. And what I love is the science and the research in Natalie's book really validated my instincts. So, Natalie, I'm really excited to talk to you. And I want to start right at the beginning. I'm going to ask one of those naive questions, if you wouldn't mind. You are, your job description is a creativity strategist. I have never heard of that profession before. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. Well, Erica, it's a real joy to be here with you today and talking with you. Thank you so much, Rotman, for sponsoring this event. And thank you, Dean Kortz, for the awesome introduction. So, yeah, getting to my job title, I reached a tipping point in my career as a professor. I was a professor for 16 years, and I had started my current company as a side hustle. And there was an inflection point where I realized I was having more fun with my side hustle than with a career that I built over time very intentionally, put a lot of work and energy and loved what I did up until a point where my intuition, to your point, Erica, was nudging me in a different direction. And this is the Cliff Notes version. I went through a series of creativity hacks on myself. I didn't realize that's what it was then. That's kind of retrospectively how I frame it. And once I realized that after I extrapolated what I loved about what I had been doing in academia and as a professor, and saw it much more in an abstraction and more objectively, I thought, okay, well, how might I still do that work and all the attributes of that work, but it's just not called being a professor. And so I love ideating, and this, of course, was over a series of months, but I landed on creativity strategist because while a lot of my work had been really grounded in design thinking, qualitative research, fashion, I have a background in anthropology and fashion, design strategist wasn't quite what I was doing anymore. And it wasn't really, it wasn't the hook for my hat. It wasn't the lid for my pot. And I liberated myself to dream, what do I want to be called? What is my job title? And creativity and strategy is something, they're both things that I love and that I'm really good at. And what's really funny, Erica, which I don't share all the time, I'm starting to share more, is that it didn't roll off the tip of my tongue immediately. And this was obviously pre-COVID. So I would have to prepare myself to, enter an event or a conference, and I would practice in the mirror. Hi, my name is Natalie Nixon. I'm a creativity strategist. And until it felt more comfortable. But the great thing about being a creativity strategist is that it always begs the question, what is a creativity strategist? And
Right.
in my work, I advise leaders on transformation, specifically by applying creativity and foresight. And as you and I will get into more, it's really about helping them to apply wonder and rigor to shift their business models, their leadership models, their own mental models. And I hope that one day there will be a lot more creativity strategists.
I think I might add that to my resume after I listen to you talk today, because that sounds like the perfect job for me. And it's really hard for those of us who are the outliers, the misfits, to name our skills. It's very hard. And so, for example, when companies and HR departments are looking for individuals to add to their team, I find, as someone who has been going through a lot of job searching, that there are so many limitations right now, and not only in the title, but the requirements of what organizations are looking for, which to me seems to limit the kind of surprise opportunities for people to apply. So how can organizations shift the way they approach HR to find these sort of outliers and misfits who can infuse creativity in an organization that really needs it?
That is such a great question. I actually just want to build on something you said, Erica, about naming things. There's real power in naming. And even when I facilitate, when I advise and coach, I really drive home the point of let's give this future scenario a name. Because when we name something, it gives it value, it makes it real. All of a sudden, we've put our flag in the sand, and it allows us to have a reference point. So there's that, like, really energetically.
Well, it's like you've invented something. It becomes real.
It becomes real. It becomes just like when you birth a little human, a little child, a baby into the world. Once you figure out their name, it starts to help to flesh out the identity into which they will grow, right? So naming, additionally, in our own careers is kind of the lighthouse of where we're headed in our career. So I really agree with you. I really love that. And to your point about the limitations sometimes in these job titles, that gets to that great strategy 2x2 of that upper right quadrant of unknown unknowns, right? There's so much that we don't realize what we actually need, that when we build, and constraints are necessary. I love that, the American choreographer and dancer Twyla Tharp wrote in The Creativity Habit that before you can think out of the box, you got to start with a box. So creativity loves constraints. We need those structures, but they have to be fluid structures. They have to be structures from which we can rebound. They're a starting place. And one way the organizations can shift that is they can even start to rethink how they're thinking about their human resources department. So, for example, there's a great media company called Vayner Media, and their head of HR essentially is Chief Heart Officer. That's Claude Silver. And so, because really what she realizes is that, and these are my words, not hers, organizations are organisms, right? They're made up of people. So she's kind of doing a pulse check on the heart in terms of who are we bringing in. So that's one thing, is just to experiment and be a bit more playful about what are we really trying to do in terms of how we are recruiting and then retaining and incentivizing people. So really, that says a lot as a signal about culture. The other thing is to lead with inquiry, to really start to cultivate curiosity-based leadership that starts with being self-reflexive and starts with asking questions about, why do we always keep hiring people from the same sorts of schools? Or why have we not hired people under age 40 in the past 8 years? Why? And mix it up. And so an example of a company that you can experiment doing this, or if you're tiptoeing into this as an organization and you don't want to, high stakes, we're really going to offer a full package to someone who might be a philosopher or might be a ceramicist or a choreographer or an astronomer in a tech company, right? And like understanding that those diverse skill sets bring an entirely new lens and set of questions. You might, if that's too much of a leap, you might push it in a much more prototyping way. So for example, Autodesk out in San Francisco, I learned this from Randy Swearer, who's the vice president of learning futures there. He's also a former colleague of mine. He was explaining to me that they really practice orthogonal thinking, which is it's a version of cognitive diversity. And one of the ways they do this is they invite people who have never worked in technology, don't really understand the specific projects they're working on. So for example, former military generals, heads of labor unions, PhDs in anthropology, to come in kind of a sabbatical short-term time, and it just infuses the project, the organization with new thinking. The other thing that they do and that I'm seeing more companies start to do, is they host invitation only sorts of I'm calling them salons. I don't think they would call them that, but these councils or salons to really try to mix up their thinking.
Yeah, in fact, I'm working with an agency right now called Sunday and Night, and they host what's called swarms, where they do an 18-hour session where they bring all these people from disparate careers and different ways of thinking, and they bring them in for an 18-hour session to solve problems. And they
I
find that,
love that.
yeah, they can get 3 years of ideas from one 18-hour session. It's really fascinating.
So smart.
Let's go back to the beginning. What is creativity according to Natalie?
Creativity is our ability to toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems. Full stop. And sometimes I add on to that, it's our ability to toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems and produce novel value. And that value could be social value, financial value, cultural value at scale. And, Dean Quartz was talking about the value of creativity and innovation. And I really agree with that. And I make a distinction between creativity and innovation the following way. I define innovation as an invention converted into scalable value. Again, financial, social, cultural value. The conversion factor to get from an invention to a scalable innovation is creativity. Creativity is that conversion factor. It's the engine for innovation.
Is it the energy required? Is it the mindset?
It's the energy required to convert from an invention to an innovation.
That
It's
creativity would be the energy?
it's the energy. It's the type of question framing and reframing that goes into the process. I'll give you an example. Last summer, in the middle of COVID, and my book launch, because why not launch a book in the middle of a pandemic? I would be mailing out signed copies of my book to colleagues and advocates and real incredible supporters of my whole process. And I would go out to the post office. And one day I was out at the beach, and I went to a different post office, and I'm in line waiting to pay. And I noticed, as I'm daydreaming, as I often do, there's a little container of Q-tips in front, air swabs, Q-tips in front of me. And I asked the gentleman who was signing me out, I said, "Why are there Q-tips in front of here?" He goes, "Oh, because people don't want to touch the keypad, the credit card keypad with their fingers. So we have Q-tips for them to, touch." And I was like, "Oh, okay, that's cool." Now, that's a kind of invention. That's not an innovation, right? What would make it an innovation is if you figured out how to produce, modify the design and the materiality of that object at scale. 2 months later, I receive a catalog that sells like tchotchkes for businesses, for like mugs and t-shirts and tote bags and that sort of thing. One of the things that they were featuring, because of the middle of COVID, is this metal key ring hook thing. So it can be a key ring, and it can also, you don't have to touch the door handle,
Right.
and you can use it to tap a keypad. So we saw the prototype, those Q-tips. So maybe someone saw something similar, and then they figured out how to then create creatively through mind energy, through asking different questions, through prototyping, plugging and playing, experimentation, convert it into now something that's monetized, produced at mass on scale. So creativity requires wonder and rigor, and I really wanted to hone in this reality that creativity is not woo-woo. It's not this addendum to the real serious stuff. It is hard work, which is why I believe more of us are not intentional about it. When we, as Dean Quartz referenced, when we only silo and ghettoize creativity among artists, A, it's naive, B, it's not fair to artists, and C, it's not beneficial to our society at large. All of us who intentionally are toggling between wonder and rigor to solve problems are engaging in creative acts, whether we are attorneys, teachers, plumbers, farmers. And wonder is about awe and audacity and asking big blue sky what if questions. It's also about pausing, which in my country, United States, we don't do that very well. But you can't wonder at 80 miles an hour. Like yeah, it's really hard to do.
Are we all born creative, or is it a learned skill?
In my view and in my research, yes, we are all, to be human is to be hardwired to be creative. And let me back out about why I think of it in that way. The other part of my wonder rigor ecosystem, I didn't stop at saying, okay, toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems. Off you go, you're creative. I also developed something I call the 3 I's. So the 3 I's are inquiry, improvisation, and intuition. These are capabilities that we to develop and hone in on to intentionally practice creativity. But look at kids, for example. There's an incredible amount of wonder that we at one point just naturally were inclined to engage in. The rigor part was not always easy for us, but I will say this: when my sister and I would go out, we were told to go outside and play, and my sister was like, she was the doyen of the mud pies. She was rigorous about how she was, mixing up the consistency of water and dirt and soil and making them up, etc. Right? So there is a certain amount of rigor, which I define as discipline, time on task, deep focus, right? Rigor is not rigidity. And we also see an incredible amount of curiosity and improvisation, which is about being adaptive and
play.
Yes, and intuition. So if we extrapolate those elements of how I'm thinking about creativity, we see it very much so, very nascent in us as children, in our own children. But then what happens, Erica?
Oh, yeah.
We go to school.
Yes. You say that school teaches out creativity.
It does. It's like it's somehow like Sir Ken Robinson.
Yes.
Who's now passed away. But I learned so much from Sir Ken. I've never met the gentleman, but loved his work.
His TEDx talk is like...
Exactly, right? But he gives that great example of, you go into a kindergarten class or first grader class and you ask, who wants to be an artist when you grow up? And like 70% of the hands shoot up. And then you visit them in like 5th grade and it's like half, 40% of the hands. And by high school, it's like, they're like the cooler, dorky kids, on the sides and the margin in the back of the class. And like, they're into photography or, in the theater. And like it's not as cool. And what's also happened was we have started to silo creativity and the arts. So our educational system, not all, but a lot, really the culture of learning and a lot of traditional education, mainstream education, is much more solutions based. It's what's the answer. It's fill in the dot in the standardized system.
I love that. The one answer. There can only be one answer. Talk about shutting people down.
Shutting people down versus multiple possible future scenarios. And think about any of you who's dabbled at all in an art discipline or design. The studio model of learning, for me, it was dance. And the studio model of learning is that your teachers are everywhere. So when you're in the studio, you could be learning from that girl over there who can do a jeté like that. Like, how does she do that? Like, let me talk to her after class, in addition to your instructor. It's all about, I don't know, try it, see what happens, right? That's what you hear much more of in the arts and in studio design pedagogy, which is why I think we begin to just kind of shove it over to there. So a lot of what I was experimenting with when I was a professor and I started the Strategic Design MBA program was that we were integrating design thinking and the studio model of learning in an MBA program. So there were no auditorium, stadium style seated classes. In a 4-hour class, we aired on 30% of the time was delivering content, a little sage on stage. The remainder of the time, students were up on their feet at the whiteboard. The instructors and professors were much more provocateurs, coaches, facilitators. The classrooms were noisy. And
So chaos.
there was a lot of chaos, but the order,
Yes.
you and I are kind of talking around this chaotic
Yes.
systems
Yep.
concept. The order wasn't the deliverable at the end. These are the design principles, these are your guardrails, which we want you to work in. Anyway, so I said all that to say that unfortunately, more than what I would like to be able to point to, more of our educational models are shutting down the inquiry, the intuition, the embrace of the process and trusting the process versus what's the one answer? I need the answer yesterday, right?
So what's interesting is that that structure forwards into the corporate structure where they allow innovation, but they order and create this innovation group over here in the corner, and then the rest of the company doesn't have access or is not invited or inspired to innovate. So my question to you would be, as a creativity strategist, how can organizations take that innovation hub and permeate it throughout the corporation so everybody can benefit and rise together?
Great question. And think about the signaling, the messaging that gives,
Of course.
indirectly to people, right? If you're not part of the innovation group. So in all honesty, there's no shame in starting there, but emphasis on the word starting there, not just landing there. And there is an incredibly brilliant woman named Sabine Junginger, a design thinking colleague, and she has, if I able, I will share a link. But if anyone wants to look up Sabine, her last name is Junginger, and she has a beautifully elegant and simple diagram that shows the ideal progression of integrating design thinking, innovation, creativity throughout the culture. So it often starts, and she does this with beautiful, just simple circles. The big circle is the organization. It starts with a little circle on the outside. You hire a consultant. So externally, you're trying to get something done. The next phase is you have a little circle in the big circle, and you have an innovation hub, a center of innovation.
So you start a little fire.
You start a little fire, right? But then you got to oxygenate it. You gotta let it, spread. And so then she says, ideally, the third stage is that you begin to see it within manufacturing, within sales, within product development, whatever. Innovation has started to take root. Now, how do we do that? Or creativity
Right.
starts to take root. My advice, especially when we're talking about creativity, I have a list of questions where I challenge people to think about starting to building KPIs for creativity. How are you incentivizing for creativity? We measure what we value, and we value what we measure. So don't just tell people be creative, but you don't give them resources in the form of budget or time, right? So if you're really intentional and serious about it, give people a budget for it. Give people the time. And time is a resource that we often, forget. We just plug on more work and job titles onto people. So incentivization, making it part of performance review, that's when we really begin to see it saturate. And then the final circle is you see that large circle. There's no more other circles on the outside. It's totally saturated in innovation / design thinking / creativity
This is
culture.
totally based on leadership. This
It is.
is absolutely a leader saying out loud to the team, I give you permission to do this. In fact, not just permission, but I expect it from you.
And not only expectation, here's budget, here's time. So I'm not going to say, I want you to approach our new marketing, a marketing strategy in a new way, but I'm still expecting you to work on all the other stuff. No, I'm an etymology nerd. I love understanding the root meaning of words. And the word decision just blew my mind when I really understood what that word means. When we decide to do something, the prefix day, of, and C day, scissors side, we are cutting. So when you make a decision in your life and work great, you are cutting off the way you used to do things, right? So if we are truly deciding that we are going to try this differently, we gotta like decide, cut off an old way. Otherwise, it's too conflated, it's too confusing, and you're not actually clearing the way to allow people to do what you need them to do. And the other thing, it has to come from the leaders who are at the top of the org chart, but emergent leaders as well. Emergent leadership means leaders who are maybe not as tenured, they're younger, but they are demonstrating insights and an ability to push us in a way where we want some of that. Or they're on the margins. Think about, the folks who are working at the cash register every day who have the one-on-one contact with your end customer.
Yes.
Those are examples of emergent leaders to also tap.
I'm thinking about bravery and the fact that there must be so much bravery and permission to be brave and permission to fail as it relates to creativity in organizations.
Yes, there's a I think it's a section or a chapter in my book called Bravery Before Mastery. And that's part of a chapter where I'm talking about intuition. And when you think about when you intuit that you should do something, intuition I define as a type of pattern recognition. It's a type of knowing without knowing. Sometimes I call intuition brain feelings. And you don't have rational data when you're intuiting that you must do something. So it requires an incredible amount of courage. Again, etymology nerd, the word courage, le cœur from the French, Old French, is heart. So when we were talking about courage, it's really about being driven from the heart. Yes. So when we were asking people to be creative, a creative act is an act of courage and bravery because it's so much immersed in process. We don't yet have evidence of how it's going to culminate, of how it's going to turn out. And so I go back to really encouraging organizations and leaders and the way we're teaching and the way we are cultivating leadership to build up inquiry-based leaders. And I get that actually from Warren Berger. Warren Berger is the author of A More Beautiful Question, the book of beautiful questions. And when the reason he wrote A More Beautiful Question is he asked himself, what makes innovative companies so innovative? So he went out and visited a bunch. And basically, I'm giving you the Cliff Notes version, he learned that leaders at the most innovative companies lead with questions. They tend to start by asking why. And they're not just why of the company, but they're very self-reflexive. They go internally as well. Then they branch out further and they ask, well, what if? And then they start to converge and ask how. So it's why, what if, how. So it's that nice diverged, converged pattern. So the act of bravery has to be modeled in leaders. It's not enough for leaders to say, hey guys, I want you to spitball. I want you to ask a lot of questions, because most of us are going to be like hands on the hips, be like, yeah, you go first, because there's usually kind of a punitive culture.
Oh my God. If you go into some sort of a boardroom and someone who is taking the floor starts talking, and if someone doesn't understand something, everyone is looking at each other around the table, but no one will speak out because they don't want to look dumb. So, even though the person talking has no clue what they're actually saying, there's BS everywhere. And so in your book, you talk about the idea of bravery and the idea of, again, from the top down, creating a culture where there are no dumb questions and people shouldn't be judged or penalized for calling out and asking questions that may seem obvious to some or detrimental to others.
Well, yes. And the point I was trying to get to is that the bravery can only be communicated if the leaders, and this was what I learned from Warren Berger, if they themselves model that level of inquiry themselves, right? That they are also modeling in a self-reflexive way. Guys, we've been at this now for about 2 months. Let's kind of do a pulse check. And I'm realizing now, I was asking myself, is this the best way? Should we be maybe asking these people over here, what have we learned so far? Because that modeling then opens up a much more an easement for others to also ask questions.
And in schools, even more so, right? In schools, no kid wants to put their hand up because they may be laughed at, or the teacher may get upset because they're being questioned in front of the group.
Well, the other thing, I was invited to produce a podcast called the Wonder Rigor Lab, and I interviewed Warren Berger, and he said something so smart. He said, part of what's happening when we invite, as leaders, when we invite others to ask questions, is we are fundamentally ceding control. Right? You're actually saying, if you're really serious about it, this could boomerang back to me, and it could be uncomfortable. Might not know the answer. I might feel attacked. But we also have to understand the psychology of what's going on in a critique, right? It actually goes back to ancient of times and the way our brains are designed when we are designed to survive through fight or flight and be part of the tribe.
Yes.
So when we are questioned and we start to feel our heart beating faster, our palms getting sweaty, our pupils are dilating unbeknownst to us, what's really going on in the limbic brain is the tribe going to desert me?
Yes.
If they're questioning me, does this mean that they're gonna flee? And where will I be? And how will I survive? Like that in the limbic brain, that is literally what's happening. Now, here's the beautiful thing. Once you understand that, you can talk yourself down from the tower. You can be like, okay, this is literally a four-walled room. Like the world's not gonna end. No one's gonna flee. I can breathe. I can absorb the question. And that actually, I have to say, for any of us who have been grounded in the arts and design, that is the beauty of the critique, the recital, the work in progress, the audition, is that it really buoys you up to be able to take the feedback, to take the questions, in many ways to distance yourself from the work. And that's a really important skill set.
Another thing that you talk about is improv.
Yes.
And I love that because, well, Canada, we're very proud of Second City because it was birthed in Toronto.
Yes.
And the concept of yes and, I think, is such an interesting skill to bring into one's life and in the boardroom or in any opportunity. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of improv within organizations?
It's critical. And understanding the importance of improvisation in organizations is really how I started down this path, because I decided to earn a PhD while working full-time as a full-time professor in 4 years. And my research was improvisational organizations through the lens of jazz music. And what one learns is it's totally possible to redesign our organizations more improvisationally. And there's a lot that we can learn from comedic improv, theatrical improv, jazz improv as heuristics and extrapolate elements of that. Here's what begins to happen when we design our learning environments, our working environments much more improvisationally. Number one, there's a generative flow that begins to happen when you commit to yes and. Number one, anyone who's ever taken some kind of improv workshop, you feel much more energized when you're doing that exercise when people say, okay, break up into pairs, and you're just going to give each other ideas. And the first time you say, nah, because nah, and then the second version is, yeah, but, and you feel a little bit lifted, and then you're like, oh, okay. And then finally, the third round, when it's just, yes, it's totally energizing, right? And again,
it forces you to think differently.
It forces you to actively listen, right?
Yes,
to the person.
yes.
It forces you to actively listen to the person, not say, okay, when she finishes talking, I'm going to go say what I need to say.
Yes.
Right? It's really about the build. Improvisation is also, to me, magical because it is uniquely situated in the present. Because if it's in the past, you're not listening, and you missed it. You just missed the gift that was offered to you, right? If it's in the future, again, you're not present, right? And that's the beauty of improvisation. And people say, oh, but like when people will say, oh, I can't improvise, because they're thinking about incredible jazz musicians or rappers or the comedic brilliance of Saturday Night Live or Second City. And that might not be your jam, but I bet you've already hacked your way
Mhm.
through at least one thing this morning, two things before lunch, in the way you support your spouse, your kids, a client, a colleague.
It's building on something. It's taking
It's
something you
building on
already have and then saying what if on top of that.
It's saying what if. It's about the remix. It's
Mhm.
about connecting disparate things, which is all about creativity. So that's why it was fundamental for me to incorporate improvisation into the way I was thinking about creativity in terms of the three I's. And one last point about improvisation: when you design your work and learning to be more improvisational, excuse me, you actually begin to naturally build a culture of experimentation. You
Mm.
begin to naturally build a culture that embraces mistakes. Because think about the way jazz musicians work and play. There's really no such thing as a mistake in jazz improvisation. You are offered something, and maybe you shift it to a different chord, and you build on that. You keep it going, and it's always this back and forth offering. And how can you, what will you now do with this? And it frees you up from the burden of, oh, I made a mistake. Oh, I made a mistake. It's like, no, let's shift this and think about it as, okay, what can I now do with this? So that's the other important thing about improvisation, is that it helps us to look at mistakes as gifts, to look at
Right.
mistakes as opportunities to build on.
And I think it's so interesting that you went to the piece about listening, because right after we talked about asking questions and leaders being open to people asking, what we're also saying is it's essential that these leaders listen to what these questions are actually saying, and that you act on what the questions are through listening and responding in some way. That's
Correct.
part of the improvisation of engagement and growth
Yes.
and building something new in a company. So it's not just allowing people to ask questions, it's listening to the questions and giving responses and starting a conversation that will build something very exciting.
That's right.
So we're talking a lot, almost hypothetically. Can you talk about the connection between a creative company or creativity and the bottom line? How
Mm.
are the two connected? Because really, that's what a lot of people want to know. How's
Well,
this going
they
to make
are.
me money?
So I'd love to share three examples. When we are creative, we must engage in more inventive thinking. Some people call that thinking outside the box, but I love what Twyla Tharp has said. Before you can think out of the box, you got to start with the box. But inventive thinking. When we engage in more inventive thinking, because we're committing to being more creative, that leads to more novel business models. And when we have more novel business models, that leads to different and new strategic partnerships. New strategic partnerships could land us in new revenue streams. That's a business impact. There's a solid through line from inventive thinking to new revenue streams. That's a business impact. Number two, when we are more creative, we can up the ante when we work collaboratively. Now, I understand a lot of people don't like to collaborate because they think, why do we have to work with this other team, this other group? We could do it so much faster by ourselves. There's an African proverb that says, alone faster, together further, right? I
Mm.
cannot possibly think of the questions, Erica, that you would think of in a given challenge and vice versa. We need that cognitive diversity, those different lenses, because I look at questions as inputs into a system. And the more diverse the questions, the more innovative the output. So when we collaborate, that leads to a burst in productivity. higher productivity often leads to greater efficiencies. And when we have higher efficiencies, costs go down. That's a business impact. So we can draw a solid line from collaboration to lower costs. And the third example, practically speaking, is that when we are creative, it's not about us. When we are creative, it has to lead to being customer obsessed.
Yes.
When you are customer obsessed, then you are trying to develop more human-centered services, experiences, products that then lead to more market share and more greater brand loyalty. Sorry, I should say it a different way. When we are customer obsessed, that increases brand loyalty, which can lead to greater market share, which is a business impact. So those are just three examples where I see evidence of a solid line connecting creativity to business impact.
I'm going to go to some questions now, because as we are talking, it's, I think, sparking a lot of creative thinking, and people are asking some really interesting questions. Someone says, I have read that the ratio of trailblazers to other profiles has an optimal point for effective execution. A room full of trailblazers doesn't work. Thoughts?
Yeah, a lot of thoughts about that. So I was hired to help an organization in the nonprofit space to reinvent, essentially, because for many nonprofits, they've got to get their arms and minds wrapped around earned revenue, and even putting on a business lens, a business mindset to the way they work, and understanding that mission is not mutually exclusive from revenue. Anyway, so it was a cognitively diverse group. It was diverse in terms of tenure at the organization. And I invited the leadership to select people who would also be crabby critics, who would be Debbie Downers, who would be people with their hands on their hips. And the reason why that, and we had at least definitely one person who was like that. And the reason why that matters is because when others hear it said out loud what the obstruction is, what the breaks are from amongst their own, and it's not just said around the coffee machine and the water cooler and whispered in the parking lot, but it's actually said out loud, it actually forces others to confront it and to say, well, is that true? Is that really true? And for them to try on some of the tools I was sharing of asking questions. And there's a way we can think about asking questions to really help each other, not challenge, but examine what has just been offered. And I always, and in my work, I'm not about giving people fish. I'm all about teaching people to fish, which I know a lot of major consultancies are not like that. They want to keep giving you fish so that you never learn how to do it yourself. But it's probably the professor and educator in me. I'm like, go forth and be able to do it yourself. I know when my work is sticking in those moments when someone else in the group perks up and they engage in conversation with that person and really begin to say, but what if we looked at it this way? And let's think through what you just said and what could happen as a result of that. So if we, like with any, so the question about trailblazers, if everyone is a trailblazer, it's no different than any other kind of sheep mentality. We all, whether the provocateur is on the negative side of the spectrum or on the positive side of the spectrum, we need to be provoked. That's an example of a constraint that keeps us on our toes, that builds in the rigor to make sure we're not just pulling stuff randomly out of our armpits, but so why do we think this matters? Why do we think this will work? Let's go back and research it. Let's go back and test it with actual people. And then let's reconvene and say, okay, you're right. Or actually, this is now making more sense. So that's the challenge in my view of only having a room of trailblazers. We always need a bit of an internal provocation.
So we have another question here. which is really a follow-up. How do you differentiate companies that say they have a culture of innovation and no questions are dumb, and those that actually mean it?
The proof is in the pudding. It's you there's a sociological term, sense making, which comes from a guy named Charles Bourget, and you can sense it in the culture. You just see and observe in meetings. Are arms crossed? Do people really ask questions? Is it a natural part of the way people are communicating with each other? And again, it does absolutely start with leadership's ability
Mm.
to ask questions of themselves, to be vulnerable about ceding control when they invite questions. So again, it has to be a feedback loop of curiosity.
Natalie, what is the single most important thing in your childhood that helped you develop your brilliant thinking and mindset? What was your childhood secret sauce recipe?
Well, first, thank you for the compliment. That's really nice to say. Uh, you know, I think my I wasn't calling it secret sauce back then, certainly, but it's probably just my goofiness. Like, and my parent just totally loving me for that. Like, I was a bookworm. My idea of a perfect rainy afternoon was to cuddle up with a book, and I was a big Nancy Drew
Oh.
chick, and younger than that, Pippi Longstocking, and then I went through this phase of like Jane Eyre and Bronte, and like in 10th grade in high school, we actually Eric and I were talking about the year 1985 before we got on this. I subscribed to the Atlantic Monthly. I mean, I was a nerd, so I think it was reading. I think it was just my love of reading, and I loved, and as a little girl, I loved fairy tales,
Mm.
and for me, so one of the techniques I really encourage people to do to build empathy, and actually the precursor to empathy, and I keep going back to this, but the precursor to empathy is curiosity, is to read more fiction, because when we read fiction, we put ourselves in another geography, another time in history or future state. We put ourselves into another gender. Like, I love a good like David Balducci beach book, like where I'm like a badass CIA agent. Like, I can imagine myself, like I don't know, it's fun. But fiction allows us to play, to imagine, and it sparks curiosity, it sparks empathy, to be in a different gender, a different ethnicity, a different time and place. So I think that it was really my parents' embrace of my goofballness. And I was a big, I subscribed to, I had a highlights mag. I don't know if anyone has ever heard of Highlights magazine, but it was this little children's magazine. I would get it once a month, and it had riddles and crossword puzzles, and I would just plague my family with riddles all the time that I was learning from Highlights magazine. So it's probably my bookwormishness that uh, was my secret sauce.
So Professor Alexander Schwartz asks, how do we convince companies that diversity, which would be racial, ethnic, class in the workforce, is necessary in order to innovate better solutions to society's problems?
Yeah, I actually just posted yesterday on LinkedIn this little diagram that I've started to incorporate into my keynotes. And I decided to do this because for two reasons. One, um, a lot more leaders at Google, at Microsoft, at the big companies have started talking about empathy, empathy, empathy. Empathy is going to be important in the future of work, and I agree with that. And I think there's a step before empathy. Before you can empathize with anyone, you must be curious. You must be curious about, why do they do it that way, not our way? Why do they sit over there and not over here? So the diagram I posted says that we need to start with curiosity. Curiosity leads to empathy. Empathy hopefully leads to action, that you actually do something about, now that you've walked a mile in this other person's shoes, or you develop a better service product experience in terms of business. And then that action needs to land in equity. So the through line, there's a real clear through line in my view from curiosity to equity. And the way I convince, when asked, business leaders about why they need to mix things up in terms of ethnic diversity, class diversity, is exactly what I said earlier about, if Erica and I were staring at a problem, I could not possibly think of the questions that she would think of, and vice versa. Questions are inputs into a system. And I'm going to raise questions that you wouldn't. And that's important. And let me just give a real short anecdote. Many years ago, I was on the board of a charter school in Philadelphia that was all about design was at the core of the curriculum. And one year, the head of development was able to get a design team from Martha Stewart Design to visit these students. And these were primarily African-American students from Philly. And these were kids who had never heard of industrial design. Like maybe they heard of fashion design and architecture, but didn't know any architects. Like, how do you even do that, right? So the whole point was to diversify the field of design. So about 7 students are selected to meet with this group of package designers from Martha Stewart Design. And they are meeting with these students. They're like 11th and 12th graders, and they're showing off their design and their portfolio. And one of the things that they show off is a can of roach spray, bug repellent, insect repellent. And one young black male teenager, raises his hand and he says, "I don't think that's good design." And they were like, "What do you mean?" I mean, we're Martha Stewart Design, we have this pedigree, we've been trained in this. And they said, "Why don't you think this is good design?" And he said, "It's too pretty. My sister is illiterate. She would think that's air freshener." And they were like, "Oh." And now, I'm not saying you need more Black folks on your teams because they have siblings who are illiterate, therefore they're going to raise that question. That's not the point of the story. The story is that young man, based on his experience and his new training and courage to raise that point out an entire miss that, not everyone is going to make a purchasing decision based on the text, right? And that's a beautiful example of why we need more diverse inputs into the system. If you're not convinced because of the moral imperative of why there needs to be greater equity and representation, then it's unintelligent business. It's like stupid business to not have more women of color, more men of color, more people who haven't been formally educated, people who are older. It doesn't make sense. Like, you're going to miss an entire section of your market opportunity if you don't have people involved in the decision-making process who will raise new and different and really important questions.
New and different and important questions. I really think that is the theme of what you do, which is to ask questions, listen to answers, listen to your heart, have courage, think differently, lead by example, and also read this book. Fantastic. The Creativity Leap. Honestly, if you look through my book, it is dog-eared and marked up. So much good, useful, practical information. I know some people are asking, Natalie, how do I, fill in the dot? You have many exercises and questions for people to work on in the book that can hopefully help people make their own creativity leap.
Erica, may I add one more thing?
Yes.
And I think this is also listed on the YouTube channel, but there's something I offer called a Wonder Rigger tip sheet. And if attendees today, I'm going to add this really quickly to the chat. If you go to a bit.ly link, bit.ly/WR for Wonder Rigger lifelong, I just put it into the chat. You can download the Wonder Rigger tip sheet. It's 16 actionable ways you can start integrating Wonder Rigger. And for everyone who downloads it today, I'm going to pick one person additionally who will get an extra signed copy of the book. And thank you, Rotman, for purchasing copies of the book for everyone. So I just added that to the chat. Thanks. This was an awesome conversation, Erica.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And really, it was my honor. And thanks to everybody who participated, threw questions in there, and of course, for having me here to lead this discussion.
Great. Thank you so much both for this conversation. We are at the end of the hour, unfortunately. The description box on YouTube is where you can find that link. The chat that Natalie was typing into doesn't appear in the public YouTube, but it is in the description. It's been put there by our staff, so you can find that there. I just wanted to add my thanks to both of you and just say briefly, I think to me, a lot of these themes around education that you touched on and how you think about preparing for leadership, they really resonated with me from the role I have, at the Rotman School. I'm always struck by how our employers almost never talk about the students that they're looking for in the job market. They almost never talk about looking for what the students know. They basically take for granted that a Rotman student's going to have mastered the content. That's not really a differentiator for students. They talk about looking for students with certain ways of approaching problems, certain kinds of ways of approaching problems, certain perspective they bring. They talk about confidence and courage and creativity, the ability to think on your feet, being open to new perspectives, being adaptable to new information, and characteristics like this that are so far away from some of the kind of dated models that you talked about of thinking about education, being shoveling facts into someone's head or something like this. So, these kinds of traits that I mentioned that you talked about today, we work so hard at the Rotman School to incorporate those through a wide variety of experiential learning opportunities that are integrated in the curriculum, because we know that's really, at the end of the day, what can make the difference in someone's leadership and their impact in the workplace. So to me, this really resonated. It's really right on point as we think about business education and business leadership. So thank you both for that conversation. Thanks also to the audience for tuning in today. This is part one of our three-part lifelong learning series. So we'll see you back next Friday, June 4th, as we continue this discussion of creativity with Yale's Craig Wright and Rotman's Maya Djikic as they discuss the hidden habits of genius. We'll see you then. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.